My name is Alex Michaelides. I'm a faculty in the finance department. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Marcin Kacperczyk, who has done a lot of work on the topics we are discussing. Marcin has been at the department since 2013, I believe, and is actually currently the managing editor of the top academic journal in finance in Europe. It's called the Review of Finance. It's trying to break the American monopoly, I guess. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. A great pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to speak in front of such a distinguished audience and tell you a little bit of my perspective on the topics that have been discussed this morning and afternoon. So essentially, the topic of climate finance has become quite close to my heart. Early in my life, I used to be actually a geographer as an undergraduate student. And at that time, the issue of thinking about climate change was actually pretty much an area that was confined to crazy scientists who thought that there is something wrong happening in the world, but in the end, no one really believed them, that there was a perspective that they are really trying to sell their ideas to get more money for their research going forward. But I think since then, we have made quite a bit of progress, and one testimony to this are conferences like the one we have today. And I wanted to tell you how my views in some sense have evolved over the last couple of years, maybe a decade or so, on the topic that is quite important in the discussion of addressing climate change, which is the topic of transition risk. So essentially this first slide is more a summary of something we all are familiar with, but I think it's very sobering to realize that all the time, I think it's almost like we all should know it at any point in time, that what we are observing is somewhat unprecedented when it comes to scientific evidence. We are basically seeing patterns in terms of global warming that could never be actually explained with natural causes in any kind of past of the ancient history. And even though, as scientists have said, we have had many times of ups and downs in terms of how temperature evolves, the speed with which these changes are actually happening is absolutely on a different scale ever noted before. So of course, as in anything that we put as scientific observation, we try to understand what causes it, and the right picture is also no mystery to anyone that one of the main causes, if not the main cause of this increases in temperatures is essentially the human intervention in terms of the production of emissions. And this graph looks more like a correlation where we are seeing at the same time the global increase in greenhouse gases kind of superimposed with the increases in temperatures. But don't get misled. This is very far from correlations. There is actually a very strong scientific evidence coming mostly actually from physicists that tells us that there is very clear link between one and the other object in the first place. So this is actually a topic of a Nobel Prize in Physics in 2021. These two gentlemen, Hasselmann and Manabe, have been at the front of research that tried to actually show us how it is that actually production of emissions globally can lead to this kind of warming effects. So I think what's important to recognize is that there is this link, and the link is very tight. And because the humans are the ones who are responsible for actually causing this problem, we actually are responsible for solving this problem. And in the way how my thoughts have evolved, I think it is fair to say that it's now probably not productive to argue whether this is for real or not. I think the evidence is just overwhelming that something is happening. I think what's more productive and more interesting to understand is what it is that we can do about it. And if you look at this particular chart that I showed you, the solution in some sense in the big picture scheme just stares at us, which is in order to solve this problem, we need to reverse this chart. We need to think about essentially what to do to actually reduce this carbon footprint that we as a society produce. And just to give you some kind of quantitative perspectives on that, currently globally we produce roughly 40 gigatons of CO2. So this is quite a lot. If you think about how much it is, this is actually a pretty big number. And what scientists are telling us is that for us to control these temperatures, we actually should try to get to zero. So again, this is probably not a particular surprise to anyone here. That essentially means that we should transition from a point where right now we produce a lot to a point where we actually produce almost nothing. So this idea of decarbonization is probably the most potent sequence of words that we have been actually using in the policy or any kind of debates of solving the climate problem. And as has been noted in the previous panel, one of the dominant approaches that people have proposed to deal with this problem was this idea of carbon pricing, or essentially a mixture of some kind of carbon tax together with the cap and trade policies. And this is an elegant solution. In fact, when it was borne out, and this was actually due to some of the environmental economists, mostly Nordhaus and Weizmann, there was quite a lot of fascination that we actually have finally found this holy grail that is going to allow us to solve this big planetary problem. And it is true in theory that that solution has a chance to actually work its wonders, but we also need to realize that as many things that work in theory, the life proves us sometimes differently. And I think what we have witnessed really is that even though we have this policy in there, the solution has not worked. And mostly because it is supposed to apply to the whole planet. We are thinking of a solution that has to be adopted by everyone, pretty much, that is responsible for this kind of problem. And at any kind of time when you have a problem where everyone needs to be involved, typically things break down. And the main problem here is this problem of coordination costs. There is too much basically that has to be coordinated across countries such that we can actually observe that this particular problem is going to be implemented at large. And this is kind of what essentially has been noted. We have noted that the decades of basically an idea that looks like in theory it should work have not produced the outcome that actually leads to a significant decarbonization. And just to give you a perspective on how actually much progress we have made, at the moment, roughly 25% of global emissions are covered by any type of carbon pricing scheme. So we are not even talking about the scale of this. Is this large or not? It's just about how much of the emissions that we actually produce are subjected to any of this. And we should not be naive about one thing. This is the easiest 25% that we have managed to implement. The remaining 75% that has to be actually subjected to something similar almost becomes an impossibility theorem. So then the interesting idea that I think evolved of this is, what is it that we actually can do differently than what we have actually done thus far? And I think I want to mention one thing, that one of the very unintended, in some sense disappointing consequences of this beautiful idea of carbon tax is essentially what I call an inertia in action. Why? Because by pointing into one particular solution that is going to solve this problem, everyone else felt at ease that this is not their problem to solve. It's the problem of the governments, it's the problem of the policymakers that has to be addressed. As such, I can just put the TV on and watch how well they are doing on that. And we know that when it comes to climate, time is a critical element. Time is not something that we should take lightly, because we have been warned over and over again that actually we don't have as much time to act with the way how physics progresses. So in this regard, this inertia has actually moved the risk higher rather than make it neutral. And I think one of the big kind of benefits of so-called Paris Agreement was to kind of denounce this as the only possibility in which we should be acting, to kind of address the possibility that maybe we should open our eyes to something else. And what I wanted to briefly discuss today is this idea of what this something else could be. And the perspective that I want to take is the perspective of a finance person, because I'm a one, and essentially the idea of involving financial markets in this kind of a mechanism of carbon pricing or carbon taxation. So briefly, why is it that essentially this is useful? Where this is useful is that it kind of puts financial institutions in the front as a potential player that can impose alternative penalty on the emitters. So essentially what I will try to convince you to today is that financial markets can engineer what I call the quasi-tax on the polluters. Of course, it's not the same notion of a tax that we have from the governments, but in a way how it actually increases the cost of the production on the polluting sector, it can have a very similar kind of flavor in how this actually works. So where this tax potentially comes from, this is the idea of transition risk. So essentially, if we think about where we are as a society, if we believe that we want to do something about climate, we recognize this idea that we need to move from 40 to 0 in a relatively medium run kind of horizon. It's not going to happen overnight, but we also don't have hundreds of years to solve it as well. And as an economist, when you look at something like this, you immediately see in front of you the word risk and the word cost and expected benefits at the same time. And what's the risk here? Of course, this idea that we are going to go from what I call the brown economy to what we sometimes call a green economy is not something that is just easy to implement. There are a lot of bumps and obstacles that potentially happen on that line. And we need to recognize that they actually cause risk both to the emitters and actually the investors who provide capital to these emitters. And there are a number of things we can be talking about here, but essentially quantifying what this cost could be or what this risk is essentially asking the question of how much penalty financial markets currently impose on this kind of sector. What kind of level of cost of capital adjustment potentially we can be talking about when we think about an object called carbon transition risk. So just briefly, oftentimes when people talk about carbon transition risk, they have sensu stricto in their mind a policy risk. They think that there is a policymaker who is going to change its behavior, and that's going to make it harder for the polluters to operate. But I want to kind of broaden this notion of transition risk to other elements. Some of them have been mentioned as well. But under this umbrella of transition risk is not just about policies, it's about technologies. And it's also about the role of the external pressure that potentially the companies are gonna actually face. And if there is one thing that you hear oftentimes when you talk to these managers of companies that need to decarbonize, why they do it, very rarely in a private conversation they would tell you, we do it because we are born, to address the climate problem. Most of the time the answer that you hear is, we do it because there is a guy next door who tells me I need to do it. So this notion of external pressure is actually extremely important. If you think that you as an individual have little impact to actually solve this problem, you may be actually quite misled. The fact that people are pressurizing these companies with their kind of behavior is actually the most effective way in which you are going to get these companies to actually react. So doing this is actually potentially leading to some particular response in terms of behavior of companies. So now, the question that is kind of interesting is, how do you measure something like this? How can you actually quantify an object called transition risk? Intuitively, it seems actually quite obvious what you want to measure, because you want to see what's the kind of level of risk that is involved in this path of decarbonization. But in practice, if you want to think of something that is going to be deployed at a large scale, and this is what we need to talk about, because we are not talking about addressing a problem of one company, we are talking about addressing the problem at the global level, you need to think of something that is actually feasible to implement. So I've been thinking a little bit about this topic for quite some time now, sometimes in cooperation with some other colleagues here at Imperial. And we started with a very simple observation, that if we want to actually think of transition risk as essentially the process by which the economy should go towards what we call the net zero emissions, the simplest way in which you can actually track this process and essentially measure how much company has to bear in terms of this reduction is just looking at the emissions themselves. So simple as it is, and of course not fully precise as it seems, it is actually a nice way to think of some kind of proportionality factor that tells you how much risk you are potentially facing. If you have zero emissions, just as an extreme case, clearly you are not going to be in this particular situation a risky player. You are going to be basically where the society wants you to be. But if you are far away in terms of your emission scales from zero, there is this path that you need to go through, and that potentially is going to be causing risk to you as a company and to an investor who supplies capital to this particular company. So now you can start becoming a little bit more detailed and say, look, today I may see a company producing quite a lot of emissions, and that may tell me something about the scope of their transition risk, but of course their decarbonization is not going to happen overnight. So in essence, the level of these emissions tells me more about where we are going to be, say, 20, 30 years from now. So that's the kind of long-term risk perspective that you are taking by looking at the overall carbon footprint of these companies. But alternatively, investors may also want to see how it is that companies are actually kind of proceeding on this decarbonization path that the society has imposed on them. So looking at something like a change in emissions or the progress in decarbonization is a sensible metric in which you can actually measure the short-term transition risk of these companies. So as I said, the key kind of benefit of this objective, first of all, is it's easy to measure. In a sense, conditional on us observing emissions of companies, we could agree that the kind of object that we are looking at is very simple. But there is actually a deeper thought that I think is actually quite relevant, and this is something on which I also want to touch in my talk today, which is this measure by itself is actually tied to an objective function that we set as a society. So in other words, if we agree we want to actually go to zero emissions, there is no better way than looking at emissions themselves to actually evaluate how well we are doing on that particular front. So that's where that kind of appeal of this measure also becomes quite interesting and relevant. Of course, there are all these limitations that we could argue about. This is looking at the past data. It doesn't front-load any kind of commitments and, of course, relies on some kind of data availability in terms of the carbon footprint of companies. But I want to contrast this with some other measures so that you can get a perspective of how people sometimes think about this and what we need to be aware when we actually put some alternatives on this particular problem. So one kind of very attractive alternative that especially got born around the whole kind of progress in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence was to look actually at some kind of textual analysis and try to measure transition risk by simply quantifying the inputs that we receive from people who are actually in the business of doing it. So simple example, look at the corporate reports and try to see what it is that managers of companies are telling you about how they are decarbonizing their operations. We have a lot of machinery out there right now that actually can do a fantastic job summarizing this kind of data. And in some sense, we can get a sense of what is the sentiment in the way how companies are actually thinking about this particular problem of decarbonization. And I'm not going to kind of try to criticize it on the basis of, is this actually potentially subject to greenwashing or not? I think this is something that is less intellectually interesting for me. What I think is important to observe, and I think this is where kind of curiosity becomes important, is that measures that are based on something like a sentiment don't have a direct correspondence in scientific evidence that we can verify it against. So in other words, unlike what we see with emissions, where we can directly contrast the objective function with the measure, when you look at something like how many times did I use the word climate in my conference call, and you say one time I used 5, in the other conference I used 4 times, it's not obvious what it means to go from 5 to 4. Are we talking about basically risk of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 Celsius difference? There is no basically easy way to quantify it other than just relatively speaking, one person is saying more about the climate than the other person. So in other words, it's very important that we actually become very disciplined in how we square these measures with the metrics that are actually our objective function. So just to take it to kind of summary of where this research in some sense leads us, if you take various measures of this transition risk, sensibly measured, what we are observing essentially is that there is quite a significant variation in the way how asset prices, and especially equity prices, respond to measures of transition risk. The evidence essentially is that companies that have higher levels of carbon footprint or they are actually lagging behind on these decarbonization pathways, on average are actually more risky. And investors who invest capital there, they are actually requiring higher expected returns. So you may ask yourself a question, is this economically relevant? And it turns out it's not a small number. When we are talking about some kind of sensible wedge between a good and a not so good company, we are talking about roughly 2 to 3% cost of equity difference per year. So this is actually not a small number. If you want a valuation kind of difference, we are talking about 10 to 15% valuation discount for the company that is actually brown relative to the company that is green. So of course, if we want to make progress on this process of decarbonization, the next step would be relevant to understand to what extent companies actually care about this difference in cost of capital. This was the topic of the previous panel. I'm not going to go there. All I wanted to say is we, in financial markets, have alternative ways in which we can actually put pressure on these particular objects. So now, a couple of more points I wanted to say. Oftentimes in practice, and I like very much interacting in practice, we also talk about alternative measures of carbon transition risk. One that is very popular is this metric of intensity. So essentially, intensity is a very similar metric to emissions in a sense that it's just an emission scale by some kind of form of revenue or production cost, depending how you want to measure that. So it's actually a very sensible measure to measure in efficiency of producing emissions. But I just want to point out one particular inefficiency of this measure, which is it's not necessarily consistent with the objective of decarbonization. And there is quite a lot of evidence, and you can bring in some very anecdotal evidence that I put up here, which essentially tells you that there are companies which are able to improve their intensity metrics. In other words, they look better and better in terms of intensity. But at the same time, they are actually growing emissions rather than reducing the level of emissions, which of course, in terms of pure decarbonization, moves them away from where we want them to go. We don't want these companies to grow emissions. We want these companies to reduce emissions. And of course, how is it that the two can happen at the same time? Well, these companies are simply growing their revenues faster than they are growing their emissions. That's what causes their intensity metrics to look good. So what I want to say is it's not so much a criticism of intensity metric. I'm not trying to tell you intensity is not a useful metric to look at. Instead, what I'm trying to caution you is this idea that if we decide to use intensity as a way to assess the progress of companies, we need to also have a clear objective function what it is that we are actually looking at in terms of saying this company has made progress. So clearly, given that intensity does not always kind of conform to the measure of pure carbon footprint, that's not a good measure to square it with the decarbonization itself. It may be a good measure of something else, but not necessarily decarbonization. And just to extend this point into a little bit more broader data, one of the key problems that we have in this idea of addressing the climate problem, at least from the pure kind of financial perspective, meaning what it is that we as investors can do, is that we know actually too much about companies and at the same time too little. So the example is essentially the last 10 years has witnessed an amazing growth of different measures of some kind of environmental performance. And this is great because we want to have a lot of data to think about these companies. But at the same time, what this has produced is an unintended consequence where people start thinking of these objects as perfect substitutes to each other. And this is a very dangerous game because as much as we have a lot of these data items to play with, they are not always telling you the same thing in terms of the objective function that you want to play with. And I have done this little experiment this summer in the preparation of another talk where I look at the global data of companies and just a couple of different metrics that I think, at least in academia, are popular and used, but I think probably also in practice as well. So I just look at measures of emission level, changes, intensity, and I superimpose them with all these measures, so-called ESG scores, and specifically the environmental scores, either from MSCI and LSEC. And the idea was very simple. I didn't want to criticize each of these measures individually. I was more curious how consistent they are with just one specific measure, which is the level of emissions. So this is just basically a relative comparison. If I think that emission level measures something, if the other measures are perfect substitute, my null hypothesis was they should be highly correlated with what these emission levels in some sense measure. And this was the answer to that question. If you look at these correlations, you find that these correlations are actually far from perfect and sometimes quite surprising. One thing that really surprised me a lot was the environmental score, where higher value means better company, is positively correlated with the level of emissions. So if you think of intuitively what this score should measure, I think this was the last thing that I was expecting. And again, I'm not trying to say that these measures are wrong. I'm just saying that they are measuring something else, probably. And we know that these measures oftentimes talk about water, they talk about waste, etc. So we can't just be using these measures as perfect substitute to each other if we want to evaluate some kind of progress and kind of metrics of transition risk. And maybe a couple of more points in the last few minutes, I guess I have. So one point I wanted to mention is the issue of disclosure. In the discussion of how we are going to address the climate problem, the key kind of challenge that we have, of course, we need to be able to assess the progress. And I already told you that one metric that is very useful is the metric of looking at emissions. The challenge that we have, of course, is that we don't observe emissions of every player in this world, which of course makes it a little bit of an uneven field and also a difficult field to actually see where the action needs to happen if we want to solve this problem. So this is important for us. Solving problems will require the push towards more disclosure. And I think this is a positive action that the governments and policymakers can take, and there are significant steps in this regard. But there is an additional thought that oftentimes is being instilled in a kind of transition made to this kind of full disclosure world. Oftentimes people say, in the absence of having full disclosure of companies, we should not actually rely on the externally produced metrics because they are actually subject to a lot of noise and they don't really do much. So the solution is don't use this kind of metric to look at companies. Instead use something else, like maybe ESG score. So I think that this is a little bit misguided. I want to believe that actually the idea that we actually have an imperfect measure is potentially a better idea than having no measure at all. This actually reminds me again of this inertia story that I mentioned in the beginning. Doing nothing is not necessarily better than doing something even if it is imperfect. And one challenge that I want to pose on the issue of disclosure is the following. Oftentimes people say, if you look at companies that they disclose their emissions and you compare this kind of carbon premium or this transition risk value relative to the companies that don't disclose but you observe their emissions from an external vendor, that risk is basically smaller for disclosures versus not. And they say that tells you that this is the right measure to look at. You should only condition on the fully disclosed emissions. But there is one little detail that people forget. When companies disclose emissions, they do it because they know that the expected benefit of doing it is higher than the expected cost. So in a sensible economic framework, you would expect that companies that disclose see the benefit of doing this action, and as such, there should not be a surprise that the penalty that they receive for disclosing this information potentially is going to be lower than the penalty of someone who does not disclose but has the same kind of level of carbon footprint. So instead of thinking of this externally measured carbon footprints as an inefficiency of the system, we should actually think of a rational model in which there is an obvious expectation that these companies are different because one decides to disclose and the other does not decide to disclose. And the last idea in the last minute, if I may, I wanted to put on the table, maybe to think forward. This is kind of something that I'm personally very excited about, is that kind of mechanism one more time. What is the force that causes this transition risk motion to move on? And I mentioned in the beginning that one force I strongly believe in is this idea of external pressure. The external pressure to me is actually a very sensible way to push companies to decarbonize. And in this role, institutional investors have been actually touted as one of the big players, mostly because actually they have a lot of reach and they can be potentially large. So simple idea of divestment versus engagement have been proposed as a way in which institutional investors can contribute to actually extending this kind of penalty on the polluting sector. And in the way how people have thought about divestment, one potential idea has been floated as a potential worry or a concern. And that idea was, if we look at the size of all the so-called ESG or socially responsible investors, the capital of these assets or these companies to divest at the moment is too small to move prices. And essentially the idea is divestment is not a good way to go ahead if you want to put pressure on the financial sector. And I'm happy to agree with that fact that right now there is maybe not enough capital to move prices if we thought just of that specific channel. But I want to plant one idea to you, which I think is actually very important, and that's not recognized directly. The idea is that financial markets have one feature that is beautiful. Financial markets discount for us the future. Financial markets are not about what we see just today, but financial markets are what we may see in the future. And of course, that depends on how much information these financial markets have. But here is the point. If we believe that the wheels of motion in this process of decarbonization and putting pressure are getting bigger and bigger, and I strongly believe in that, it is not a phantom to imagine that more and more companies are going to engage in this kind of process of net zero alignment, etc., in their portfolios. And then it does not become any more such a phantom to believe that what the markets may be discounting today is not only what you observe today on the real side of these investments, but also what you may be expecting to see in the next 5, 10 years, etc. And just to put some numbers, and that's going to be the end of my talk, there is basically an initiative that I'm sure practitioners are keenly following, but many academics these days as well, which is called the net zero portfolio, which is essentially the idea that you want to align your portfolio with the scientists in terms of the decarbonization of this portfolio going forward. And essentially this idea is another way of saying that we are going to put more and more penalty on the polluters if they want to stay within our portfolio. And what I want to point out to you that the principle of net zero portfolio, where investors want to do something that is consistent with IPCC or some kind of net zero objective, is not a small number. This is basically the size of how much capital is currently subscribing to this kind of principle. Don't get misled. This is not how much capital currently is divesting of these assets. This is the expectation idea, not necessarily the realization idea. But again, if we believe what financial markets are doing, and they are discounting the future, this is what they may be discounting today, even though you are not observing this divestment yet in the real time. I think this is something that I think may have actually a real play and something to look at quite into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Fascinating and great enthusiasm as well, which is always good to see. The focus on transition risk clearly has merit, and I totally understand why you see this, because obviously you come from the financial perspective. The element that I didn't hear is the fact that transition risk inevitably is linked to policy action. It has, you're absolutely right, it has technology as well. So in the model, and it will be very interesting to see the exercise if you do that, that model will need to take into account that whoever does the transition risk and tries to value it will always have that uncertainty as to whether the policy will move. So you always have that back and forth, who is going to move first. Mm-hmm. Another idea I would like to maybe plant, if I may, is it has come to the point that actually physical risk is becoming more certain than actually transition risk. And this is where we are at a moment in time that there is so much to take into account in a risk analysis that it becomes very attractive. Mm-hmm. So I would love to hear more about that analysis when you do it, but I definitely encourage you to do the physical risk. And because we talked a lot about PCAF in the previous sessions, you were not here, and I was one of those people who helped develop some of these. I should say, and I hope you will like this, PCAF always encouraged absolute emissions in addition to the intensity. So certainly in the industry, we know very well what that means. So thank you very much, very interesting.
Thank you so much. So maybe briefly, I fully agree with comments 2 and 3. I think something to think about definitely. On policy, I don't disagree. I just think that uncertainty can also exist at a significant level, even in the absence of the policy framework. I mean, the simple story of where this technology going to come from, at what cost we are going to be able to access it, or how much pressure we are going to face from these external stakeholders. These are things that don't necessarily have a policy flavor, but I think they do definitely affect, or it should at least in theory, have an impact in terms of asset prices. So that's, I think, is a useful way, how I see that we should go beyond policy, which is not an alternative to policy. I fully agree that policy is important.
We are a net zero asset manager firm. However, we really quite disagree with the greenhouse gas emission reduction at portfolio level. We want to think about greenhouse gas emission reduction from a sector level, which I suppose sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we've got the industrial gases, which are super high in scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, but really are enabling other more hard to abate sectors to decarbonize. So we've seen quite a lot of clients asking us for the 4.1% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030, but actually are really worried that leads to a significant greenwashing because portfolio managers are chucking out, the industrial gases, the ArcelorMittals, the cement companies, just to get to that point, once a year where they can report to their clients. So we are quite concerned about that and want to differentiate between sectors, location, emerging markets versus developed markets a bit more.
I think it's a great point, just to restate the idea that we should acknowledge what we call the broad kind of engagement of the economy, if I may restate, that we should not essentially try to decarbonizing these portfolios by excluding certain sectors from the industry. I fully agree with you. I wish I had more time to tell you what you can do with that framework like this, because that's the kind of idea. The idea that at least I'm also trying to understand better, and it would be great to compare our notes, is not to think of it as we are just going to sort companies in terms of actually emissions, and that's what's going to lead to exit from the portfolio. The emissions are only useful as a way of finally assessing the budget that you have, which is how much you can fit into that portfolio. And I think on that front, we probably don't disagree. That's essentially the idea of net zero portfolio, which is following the scientists. So I think there is just one challenge, maybe if I can plant to you, because I thought about it quite a lot, also in the context of practical implementation of this, which is it is reasonable to think about engagement at the level of industry, and this is quite happening. But there is a little bit of a difficulty, which is coming up with the decarbonization paths at the industry level. We have some guidance from scientists, but this is typically very localized. It's only for certain sectors, not for the entire economy. And the challenge is that typically these decarbonization paths are, as I'm sure you would agree, are geared towards scope 1 and maximum scope 2 emissions. So in this regard, you are kind of ignoring a big chunk of the economy, which historically used to be considered green, but these days we actually learn, I have in mind, for example, technology sector, these days is actually presented as one of the biggest problems because of all the development of AI and all these like great computers that require so much energy to actually be run. So in this regard, without the guidance of what the paths for this industry should be, it's very hard to implement it at the industry by industry sector because we don't have that basically projection path. So the best you can do is just to think about the kind of broad alignment of the portfolio, which invites all the companies in some sense on an equal footing. So some kind of industry neutrality, etc., is what I have in mind. Yeah.
Yes, super quick. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Simone. I'm an Imperial alumnus, and right now I'm working at a company called Unwritten, where we try to quantify transition risk. This talk was very interesting, very relevant. And you mentioned that you've seen evidence of pricing of transition risk in the form of climate sentiment, looking at corporate reports, and also tracking emissions. So there is evidence of pricing. But have you looked at how and what models are used to price transition risk to quantify within companies? And have you thought about how apt they are from an academic perspective?
Sorry, I didn't hear you
Yes,
properly.
I can repeat.
I thought about what, sorry?
You mentioned that there is evidence of price and transition risk, for example, looking at the differential in emissions between net zero. But how are companies actually quantifying that in monetary terms? And what methods are they using, and are they apt in your perspective?
Companies as the real companies?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the only thing I can tell you much, and then we can maybe talk over the break, not to get too much. The way I'm thinking of this is a pure kind of valuation perspective. So I'm trying to fit into these companies the kind of discount rate that they should apply when they are trying to value their investments. How they are actually valuing these projects, if this is maybe what you are asking, of course, it's a difficult question for me to know. So I'm following a very simple kind of NPV principle where the discount rate is going to enter into your valuation, and that's what I'm trying to impose on this company's valuation model. But of course, that's something that would require a little bit more detailed information about what practices companies follow. Just as evidence from some survey data, if you look at Fortune 500 companies, that CFOs of those companies have been surveyed how they actually typically evaluate their projects. NPV has been by far the most dominant kind of metric, which may be surprising because it's a very simple metric, but surprisingly it's actually quite a most popular measure that is used at least in the large scale.